Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Switch Statement Podcast. It's a podcast for investigations into miscellaneous tech topics.
This is our 17th and final episode in our series on the art of game design by Jesse Schell.
Hey, John, how are you doing?
Hey, Matt. I am doing very well. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. I've got my microphone oriented the correct direction because
That's always important.
After how many of these episodes? They're almost 30. You'd think that I would know that.
I'm always glad when you have minor audio mistakes because I feel like my audio is just a complete mess all the time. So it makes me feel a little better about myself.
You need like walls and like a structure to your.
I need to go in like Nutty Putty Cave and record there.
Nutty Putty Cave?
Yeah. Sorry, that's a random reference. Have you ever heard of Nutty Putty?
That?
Oh my God, you don't want to know. It's like the most horrible thing to ever happen.
All right, what should listeners Google? Should they just type Nutty Putty Cave into?
This is a PSA to never Google Nutty Putty Cave. That's why I brought it up, because I just want to tell people to never ever Google it, including yourself, Matt. Please don't Google it because it will scar you for life.
Dude, there's nothing more counterproductive than telling someone to not Google something.
I'll also throw this in. It's not interesting in any way, shape, or form. There's nothing compelling about it. It's just, have you ever heard
you're making it work. You're definitely as far as from where I'm sitting right now,
sign?
There's buried treasure associated with you're just doing everything in your power.
Have you ever heard that there's a sign that's like outside of a nuclear waste dump that's like,
oh yeah,
there's nothing special in here. Like there's nothing important in here. This is, excrement or something. I can't remember what the sign is, but this
is that whole nuclear semiotics thing, right?
Yeah.
All right, well, Nutty Putty Cave is where all of the nuclear waste is, so you shouldn't go there.
Yeah, never explore.
But today we are wrapping up, if you can believe it, last episode in The Art of Game Design by Jesse Schell, and we're talking all about interacting with clients.
Indeed, and congratulations, by the way, we got through this book.
We did it.
It was a ton of fun, and I'm looking forward to many, many more books.
Which, you know what we need to do? We may need an ancillary episode. It's not going to be the next episode, but wrap up Godland. We had some interesting ideas there. Maybe just do one last takeaways from that, because we started to get into territory where I think Godland was a little bit less, didn't relate very well to the topics at hand. But I don't want to. We didn't forget about Godland.
Yeah.
It's still there. Maybe for a future endeavor, but just in case listeners are just really wondering about what's going on there, we may do a future Where Are They Now about Godland.
Yeah, we should tie that in a bow. That would be fun.
But today, though, yeah. So, what did you think about these chapters and about our experiences as THKP building games?
Yeah, I mean, I really like these chapters, both from our experience as entrepreneurs, which was its own unique thing, but also from professional experience, just working with product managers and basically working with people who are coming up with the ideas of the thing you're building and sort of learning how to manage that relationship, learning sort of what you know versus what the other folks know. He has this section, which I really like, which was on coping with bad suggestions.
Yeah.
Which is something it's always going to happen. And I shouldn't even use the framing like bad suggestion. Like a lot of suggestions coming from a user are just going to be very isolated to like an individual instance or some individual experience. And there might actually be greatness in the suggestion. There might be kind of this kernel of like a fundamental flaw with whatever you're building. And it's so important to be able to take a suggestion that might immediately sound terrible and be able to kind of realize the kernel that needs to be plucked out and actually explored. And I'm actually a huge fan of product managers. A lot of engineers hate product managers, but I think a good product manager is just so important to the success of any piece of software. And I think that's, part of the reason Math Chops did, decently well, is because Mike is an amazing product manager, whether he knows it or not.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's so important to have someone to fulfill that role. I mean, even if you're on a tiny, weekend video game project, you should have someone who's thinking through that lens. Because if everyone's just hyper focused on the technology, you're going to miss the mark. You need someone who's, actively spending cycles on managing the product.
It's funny because I've never really run into a situation where I feel like I've always had a healthy relationship where it's like I can have my opinions about what the product should be, but I understand that just for everything to be able to move forward, we need someone whose job it is to make a call.
Yeah.
And I think it's just, I don't know, I think it's not productive for you to just keep on hounding about on the same point. Even if you disagree, I think it's kind of like disagree and commit. There's the person whose job it is to make these kind of decisions. And I've always found it to be kind of a freeing relationship where it's like, this is on you, to make, I can give you my perspective as a technical person or someone who's using the software. But I'm completely at peace with the fact that at the end of the day, it's your call. So
yeah, no, I completely agree. He uses the word freedom and kind of having it be liberating. I think it's so liberating as an engineer to have a good product manager where you can just kind of sit back and relax. The product manager takes all of these random suggestions from, whatever the CEO or users or user researchers. The product manager has to convey that to engineers in a way that, can be communicated on. And as an engineer, your only real job is to deal purely in factual information.
Right.
It's like the product manager tells you to implement something and you tell them, okay, that's going to take 9 weeks because of X or Y technology limitation. And then the product manager has to take that into account and maybe come up with a different way of doing it.
Yeah.
And it's, I think it's so liberating to just live behind that wall of insulation. Because, being entrepreneurs as we had to directly consume that stuff. We were the firewall oftentimes. And
right.
That's much harder. It's a much harder job and it has a lot more, risk and reward, calculus.
Your point being that we're the ones who have the beautiful vision of the way that it could work. But then, so in that regard, we're the product manager. But then we need to allow our technical understanding to maybe talk us down from building this thing that's going to take a super long time.
Right. Or even having the bravery of building it in a way that will take longer.
Yeah.
Because my inclination always is to do it in the simplest way. And I often forget about the user, which is, this is like Google gospel. You should always think about the user and literally everything you're doing. But it's hard. If you're an engineer and you can think of a way to do something in 2 hours that might have some slight compromise in the UX, that will be your inclination because everyone's lazy, but you may not realize the full cost of that compromise. Maybe that hurts the user experience in a minor way, but across millions of users, that could be a major thing.
It's funny because I feel like I've suffered from the opposite problem where I have some, and I think I've gotten better at this, but I have some idealized vision, and any sort of compromise from that, it feels like that's a major step backwards. Or it's more like I might not be spending enough time thinking if there are 80% solutions that are 1/10 the cost to implement, and this this is this is a recursive problem, I think, where this happens kind of at a bunch of different layers.
I have noticed that, like, about, our dynamic. This is one of the reasons I thought our team was so effective, like you, Mike, and I, is because we all had fairly different approaches to things. I am extremely on the end of, like, I just want to do this as quickly as possible, even if it's like messy, and just get something out into production so that users can, like, hit it and we can get feedback. I am, like, hyper extreme on that end of the spectrum in a way that's often wrong. I'll just come out and say it. And I think I don't think you're extreme. You're, like, more moderate, but you are much more in the domain of, like, you kind of want to do it the right way. You want to do it in a rigorous way. And if there's some super superior user experience, you're going to lean towards that. And I think that we actually sort of average each other out in a productive way. Like, that leads to a better product, because both of us, are sometimes on the wrong end of the exact right Goldilocks zone. So we kind of tug each other in opposite directions.
What I like about that is it is still, and I think this is true, like, it biases towards action, which I think is super important. Our center is still, kind of like on the, if I'm hypothetically in the middle and you're super far on the, like, delivery side of it, then, like, our center of mass is oriented towards delivery. So I think that's a good thing.
Definitely a good thing, because that is so important, just to get something in front of users. And I feel like we've harped on this a billion times, but can't just sit around and design.
Right. To get back to your point, so dealing with bad requests. So he has this example where the client essentially asks this team who are building a racing game, hey, can you add Chrome to the cars? And if you're not immediately familiar, so this is I think in the 90s or, like, the early 2000s. And it's like, this is a really complicated texture, right? Because you need to either fake something that looks reflective or, actually have reflections. And if the geometry is non-trivial, then, like, that could be really, really hard and really computationally intensive.
Yeah.
And it's a parable about taking the suggestion. The client says, can you add Chrome to the cars? And, like, a gut reaction could be like, there is no way in the world that we can add Chrome to these cars, because, like, it will throw off our production timeline. It will completely push like, it may not even be technically possible with the hardware. But then, what he recommends is taking a step back and trying to understand where the request is coming from. And in this case, what they learn is the client was like, oh, I just wish the cars could move a little faster. But, like, I assume that would be, obviously in the real physical world, like, making a car go physically faster is, like, very difficult. Yeah. So, like, adding a little Chrome is, like, so easy. But then, of course, like, the client doesn't necessarily understand any of the technological aspects of this. So it's like, understanding where that's coming from. Yeah. And, like, just to wrap that up, it's kind of like, to your point before, it's like your product manager could come to you and be like, hey, can we put the widgets on the Gigaplot? And then you're like, that's going to take a month. But, like, and you might react, like, super strongly, but through a little bit of interrogation, you might learn actually, like, what they really care about is something that you can solve in a much simpler way. So I think, go for it.
No, I mean, I love that you brought up that example, because it was such a good example of how a user may want something, but they don't realize what they actually want. And so they ask for something that is actually completely different from what they want. And that's why I've said for the past few years, basically ever since I worked at Instagram, that user research is the most important role on a team.
Yep.
And that's why, because user researchers have to be the ones. They're literally on the front line of, like, taking words, a user is speaking or writing or whatever, and converting those into like actionable things that you can do with the product. And then the product manager actually has to figure out how to like accomplish that, you know, within the product itself, you know, using like user interface and all those things. But the user researcher is the one that's sort of like mining the raw ore of, you know, what users need and what they want. And so it's so important to like have someone who has that ability to like tease out those little, you know, nuggets of, you know, user needs.
Right. They kind of sift through it all, and they kind of merge it all together until it's something useful.
Yeah, exactly. They're panning in the river, and, you know, it's so easy to throw out those little flecks of gold, but a good user researcher can identify them and pull them out.
One thing about this chapter that was very interesting to me is it speaks to an arrangement we've never really had, where you start with this beautiful vision about a game, but you don't have the resources to build it. And so this is you talking to someone ostensibly with money who's going to be able to pay you and a team to build it.
Right.
And it's interesting because we have always been on the side of there's someone with an idea and money, and they want us to build a game, which is honestly like that's an amazing place to be in. I think I feel very fortunate to be in this place. I mean, I guess it depends on the kind of person. And Math Chops, we were much more, I guess, in the like we didn't have a client with a big pile of money. I guess we had a billion clients with a little bit of money each, but but yeah, it is interesting because, and I guess in a way, I'm like, you know, you and I are not really game designers in the sense that Jesse Schell has been talking about this whole time, which is like you have this pure game vision that you want to kind of sell directly to someone.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I guess that was something that had occurred to me.
Well, yeah. And so are you referring to, because in the next chapter, he talks all about like pitches and pitch rehearsals and all that stuff. And I actually thought of the 3 chapters, I actually found this one to be the most interesting for a few reasons. First, he sort of started out the chapter by defining what power is. Yes. And his definition of power was to be able to get what you want. Yeah. And like, is that like a textbook definition of power? Because that was kind of very interesting to me.
Well, the really interesting about that statement to me is like, he goes on to say like, you need to know what you want.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like, whoa, like that's actually a really interesting point, because I think sometimes there are people who want other people to be able to, or want other people to do things for them, but they actually don't even have a very clearly defined vision of what that looks like.
Yeah. No, exactly. It's like, you know, being able to know what you want to the level of specificity where you can then pay someone to pull it off. That's that's a bridge too far for a lot of people, including myself. I mean, being able to convert my own ideas into like, you know, basically an actionable list of like to-do items, it's very hard.
Yeah.
He talks about how the value of an idea, and like whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. You know, if it's a good idea, that obviously adds to the value of an idea. If it's useful, that adds to the value. If you're in the right place to like implement that idea or pursue that idea, that makes it even more valuable. But then he mentions this sold convincingly. So it's like the 4 aspects of what makes an idea awesome. If it's cool, if it's useful, if you're in the right place, and if it's sold convincingly, which I think a lot of people don't think about. You know, when they're just thinking about the raw value of an idea, how that idea is sold is so important. I mean, there's so many good ideas out there. They're almost a dime a dozen. But being able to take that idea and sell it to someone who's going to give you money to implement it, I mean, that's like a whole other ballgame.
The other thing I wanna call out here is if some of our listeners are like less seasoned, you may be thinking to yourself, "Oh, I'm not planning on being a game designer, so like I'm not gonna worry about pitching." But it doesn't need to be a pure always like a pure selling where someone is paying you to implement an idea. You know, you
Yeah.
could be selling an approach in your engineering organization.
Yes.
Or like at Google, the promo process is a sales pitch about yourself. It's like, and what's funny is you can't think about it at the end. You can't just think about it when you're going up for promo. You almost need to be designing what that story is going to be from the beginning, you know?
Yeah.
Which it's so funny. And the way this dovetails with what I was about to say is like, I can spend so much time on the technical aspects of things and completely ignore the pitch.
Yes. Common mistake.
And I think it's something that a lot of engineers fall into. You know, it's kind of, and I think this is kind of systemic in engineering, underappreciating selling. You know, and
Yes.
it takes so many different forms where it's just like the if you build it, they will come kind of business approach, which
Yeah.
is just a classic failure. Were you going to say something?
Yeah. No, I think this is such a good point. Like, because I think it flies in the face of sort of this engineering doctrine, which is like things should be able to kind of stand on their own.
Right.
You know, like if there's some piece of software that just is intrinsically valuable, then you don't need to sell it at all. Like it will just work and people will love it. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is that's just not the case at all. I mean, even though we are all ostensibly scientists and we have the ability to consume information and like tell whether it's factual or not, like we're still these emotional creatures. And, you know, if some language X is being sold in a way that's sounds more exciting than language Y, people are going to gravitate towards language X. Like it's that simple. So,
I mean, this is something I feel like you've been getting a tremendous amount of experience with.
yes.
In your, like, with the stuff you've been working on, right? Haven't you needed to be like selling a lot of these kind of big architectural shifts?
Yeah. And I'm learning a ton at my job because basically when I came back to Google, my job went from being like a boots on the ground engineer, just kind of working on features, to being more of like a strategist, like an engineering strategist, where I'm like, okay, for the next 5 years, we should start to move our architecture over to something that looks more like this. And I feel like I've dealt with so many ideas, like I've gotten so many ideas from people on the team, which are really, really good ideas and would be purely positive. But it's, you know, the difficulty is not finding those ideas. The difficulty is taking all of those ideas, packaging it up in a way that I can kind of communicate to leads, communicate to the team at large, in a way that makes complete sense, you know, fairly uncontroversial, and communicating the return on investment and, you know, all of these things that like, I think a lot of people develop a gut feeling for if they work in the industry long enough. They just kind of, they hear an idea and they're like, okay, that's a good idea. But you still need to be able to take that quote unquote good idea and like truly communicate why it's good. What I found in myself is I'm needing to take these things that so far in my career, I've never actually talked about. Mm-hmm. I've just sort of like put into practice. Like I've always been a practitioner. So I'm never like, you know, I never like hear an idea and I'm like, go tell it to the next person. It's like, no, I'm taking that idea and I'm implementing something based on it. Mm-hmm. So I'm taking all these things that I've learned as a practitioner and learning how to like communicate them to a broader audience. And it's been fascinating. Like I feel like I'm learning a ton and, you know, hopefully improving my communication skills, which is becoming a lot more important to me.
Right.
But yeah.
And one of the things that's interesting to me is you're kind of playing both sides of this interaction, right? It's like you're talking about people coming to you with ideas. And in a way, that's its own tiny little pitch, you know? And so then you kind of take all of those pitches to you, to like that people are making to you. And then you have to kind of in a product manager-y sense, distill that into this consistent vision and then project that out.
Yeah, the way you describe it is how I see it. Like, I see myself as a curator. Like, I'm not really, like, sure, I've taken a few ideas and kind of put my own spin on them, but like, I don't think I'm coming up with any like grand original ideas myself. I'm talking to people who've been on the team for like 10 years, and I'm like, okay, what have you observed? And I'm taking these observations that they have, and I'm, sort of, I kind of am a product manager. I'm sort of panning for gold, to use that earlier analogy, and trying to figure out like, okay, can we take all this gold flakes and kind of melt it down into an ingot? And that's what I'm presenting to the team, is this ingot. But this ingot's been forged by ideas from all across the team. It's not like my own ingot that I've pooped out myself. So it's a super interesting process, but very different from what I was doing before as an engineer.
Right. Yeah. So, there's a couple of tips. So he has a series of tips. Like, this is mostly just a list chapter about like tips on pitching. One thing that stood out to me was the exude confidence tip, where he says he has a magic trick, which is to say absolutely when answering a question. Kind of like, oh, like, can the server support this load? You say absolutely. And it's like, I had like a visceral reaction when I read that.
Yeah.
Where it's like, I just know it's the kind of thing where you're like, I guess I'm never going to be a salesman, because it's like, I don't know if I could ever not have some engineering answer. Yeah. It's like, well, we've seen it perform well under load. Like, it's like, no, you need to just be like, oh yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
No, I completely agree. I was like cringing during that. It felt like just be more like Trump,
Oh my God.
Not to go political, but it was almost like he was using, like the way that he talked about, selling your ideas, it was sounding to me like the way that Trump would sell things. Like, just say the word tremendous all the time.
Yeah.
And you're good. And I don't know. I think you and I just have way too much of that. I don't even know what it is, but like, we just have to be honest.
Yeah.
And if there's even an inkling of doubt in our mind, we like have to put it out there in some form.
Yep.
And I don't know. It's definitely a hindrance.
I heard a story. I mean, this is probably like pretty common knowledge at this point, but when Bill Gates and Paul Allen were starting Microsoft, they just read an article about the Altair 8080 or whatever this machine was. They called up the company and they said, oh, we've written a basic interpreter for your machine and we would like to sell it to you. And literally they had not written a line of code at that point. They just said, like, we already have it. And like, can we demo it to you? And then once they got the meeting, they like worked really hard and like built it. But it's like, that is the kind of hubris. And the thing is, I guess there's like, the reason that we know Microsoft today is because like they pulled it off. Yeah, right? They just so happened to be right about the fact that they could do that. But then there's a bunch of people all the time. I don't know, like Elizabeth Holmes.
Yes.
It's like that turned out like she basically did that, but then the science reared its head, and it's like, oh wait, actually, you've said something that's impossible. So,
right. Yeah.
Sorry, you're a fraud.
You have to ask yourself the question, like, did Bill Gates know that it was possible before he was making these outlandish claims? Or was he, was there a time where he was more like an Elizabeth Holmes, where he was just kind of preaching these things that he didn't even know if they were possible or not? And he just got lucky that they were. Right.
I think to a certain extent, yeah, probably. He was a little bit lucky, because it's like, how many times have you gone to solve a problem that sounds possible only to, and who knows, maybe he had already done something similar, like he'd already written some sort of like parser or something, and like he knew that he already had that experience, but sometimes it's just hard in a way, like the machine, maybe the machine is a nightmare and like you can't even program for it, like then you just look like a jerk. But it's like, those are the people that succeed, the people who take that risk.
Right. And it's so funny because America, just, from a cultural standpoint, I feel like we worship that mentality. Like that, a lot of the heroes in sort of American lore, and other countries may do this too, I'm not sure, but so many characters in American lore have this just insane hubris. But the reason we worship them is because they don't get punished for the hubris. Whereas, if you go back to like Greek tragedies, everyone always got punished for their hubris or Shakespearean things. Like, that's what culture was teaching us at that time, is that this hubris is like bad. It will be your downfall. And I feel like a lot of the stories in modern America are the opposite. It's like, no, you have to have that overconfidence. You have to kind of always be closing. But we don't preach the downfall side of things. I mean, we have these stories like, Sam Bankman-Fried or whatever that guy's name is.
Yeah.
Which happen all the time, but we quickly just label those people as like psychos or like charlatans or frauds or whatever, not realizing that they look just like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, but it's just that Steve Jobs and Bill Gates got lucky that they were able to back up their ideas with these brilliant implementations. And I don't know, I'm not really putting Sam Bankman-Fried and Steve Jobs on the same. I'm not saying they're, similar, but I just feel like the hubris goes two different directions.
I think that's a useful exercise to be like, okay, is there anything different between Sam Bankman-Fried and Steve Jobs? This probably sounds like an absolutely absurd comparison, but
I think it's useful. I like to ask myself the question: what if Steve Jobs didn't have a Steve Wozniak,
right?
Who is basically a wizard who could pull off all of these crazy things. And I don't know. Like, I honestly think if Steve Jobs wasn't working with Steve Wozniak, like we wouldn't know his name. He just would not be the same thing he is today, because working with a person like Steve Wozniak, and I don't mean to like really turn the engineer into like the real hero behind a story, because I think that's also a fallacy, but it enabled Steve Jobs to just talk the biggest game possible. Yeah. And he sort of knew he could back it up because he had that, that trump card in the form of like a Steve Wozniak who could just implement anything, apparently. So I think it's interesting.
I in a way, I think Steve Jobs is kind of like the Uber product manager.
Yeah.
He is the platonic ideal of a product manager who he hears an idea and he just sees that it's what people would want if it existed. And he's not afraid to just ruthlessly go about implementing it.
Yeah.
If there's one thing that I can appreciate that Apple does, is that they're not afraid. Well, in the Steve Jobs era, they were not afraid to make these hard decisions about, it's like, nope, we want this consistent, because there's so many times where it's like, you can just see there are two organizations in a company, and it would just be like a big pain in the butt to try to merge them together. So they just remain two different things. The user experience is super confusing, and like they're like, oh wait, why? So this there's a good example of this. I just watched a YouTube video about like Google's fitness scenario, right? Google has they own Fitbit, and they also own they also have their own Google Fit app. And it's like, I think it's pretty obvious that those should be one experience, and like you should converge towards one experience as quickly as possible, even though, because it's like, oh yeah, that's going to be painful in the interim because there's a bunch of teams. You might make like, it's probably a political thing because the Google Fit team doesn't want to get absorbed by Fitbit or vice versa. But it's like, in a way, it's like what the user experience is. You should take the long view of this, and it's like we should just ruthlessly combine these right now because like it's only going to make things worse if you delay this. But
yeah, no, I that's a super interesting point, because I think that's one of Google's, like if I were to, and I don't understand business stuff, but I think Google has a huge problem in this, like it's a massive loose federation of teams who are often just acting in complete contradiction to one another, or they're building the exact same thing. And it's just kind of a mess. And it is interesting because I think other companies have a similar like way of working, like Amazon, for instance. And I'm speaking out of pure just stuff that I've heard, like anecdotes, but Amazon is also a loose federation of things, but they went really hard into the, like, every team is just developing an API.
Yeah.
And so if you're a team, looking for some service, there might be 3 teams that implemented an API that provide that service. You're going to pick one of them and run with it. And so the way that you survive at Amazon, it's almost like a survival of the fittest type thing. It's like, 8 teams might build this API, but if one team gets used way more than the other ones, that's it. Like, that's the team that's going to survive because they get funding and, they get more headcount or whatever. Google, on the other hand, at least to me, it seems to have a lot more politicalization behind some of these things where, you might be a lead of some team, and even if your team isn't getting a lot of traction at the time, you have a lot more of an ability to, like, continue to breathe life into your team, which could be a good thing. I mean, because a lot of times usage does not necessarily mean something is better.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think to your point, the most important thing at the end of the day is the user experience. And if the user experience is suffering because of the way you're conducting business internally, that's a problem. So, I think it's something that companies should think about, especially these massive companies who have tons of different teams with egos and all that. But one thing I did want to segue into, just talking about Steve Jobs, a skill that he had better than anyone else I can think of was something that Jesse Schell mentions, which is to make it easy for someone else to pitch.
Yes.
So your pitch has to be so good that the people you're pitching to then go and make a pitch to all their friends.
Yeah.
And I think this was something that Steve Jobs knew how to do so well. He just understood human psychology to the point where he could give you the 2-minute elevator speech, and that's all you were talking about for the next few months. And I think that, if we're talking about what's made Apple so successful, like, that is definitely one of the things was his ability to do this.
Yeah, I think that was his superpower. I think he really understood how to think on behalf of his users. So, all right, but let's move on to the next section. So the final chapter that we're going to talk about in this book is the designer and client want the game to make a profit.
Right.
So, and again, Math Chops is an exception, but Math Chops also is kind of the least gamey of all of the games that we've built. But yeah, I think in the other cases, like, we've never needed to really care about whether or not these games made a profit, or they were completely free and just scientific in nature. So, I feel like we didn't really have this experience of, like, okay, how do we design, like, a pure game that we need to make a profit?
Right. Yeah. Which is, just thinking about it gives me anxiety, because games cost so much to create. Yeah. Like, even if you're just creating the simplest game of all time, like, you need design work, you need music, you need engineering, and all these things require expertise in order for them to even reach that, like, minimal bar of quality. Yes. And so I view, even a simple game is just such a costly operation that I guess hats off to people who make games, because they're entering into just a zone of tremendous risk. where they're spending a tremendous amount of resources in order to build something that might not make any money at all, frankly.
Yeah.
So it's scary, but it's part of, and Jesse Shell talks about this, like there's ways that you can sort of validate your ideas and make sure that there is meat on the bones. And I think that that's why a book like this is so important, because you can kind of build up that framework to know, like, okay, this idea might work, or to know that, okay, I need to get investors in order to like actually do this. And I think that's one of my takeaways from this chapter.
It's so funny because I feel like modern times, it's almost paradoxical what situation we're getting, because it's like the requirements to make a AAA game are higher than ever and harder than ever. You need to build this whole world. Like Cyberpunk, was it 2077? Is that the right year?
Yeah, that's right.
So it's like this incredibly detailed, deep world where there's all these spaces, and it takes so long to generate. But at the same time, like the tools have also gotten so much better, and the ability to self-publish has also become possible. So we simultaneously have this weird situation where you have real big studios who they're kind of not paying their developers very well, because it costs so much money and they need so much work to put into these games, which may not be financially successful. But then you also have all these tiny indie games which are made by one person. They're still really high quality. And it's like I'm having trouble squaring that circle a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, how could both of those things be true at the same time? Like, I guess that's my question.
Yeah. No, it is insane. Like, I'm constantly amazed because there's always these stories of like indie developers or individual developers who come out with some brilliant game. I love the Stardew Valley example because I love that game, and it truly was just a single individual who like built the whole entire thing.
Elden Ring, one guy.
Yeah, Elden Ring. One, Miyazaki. He just like worked in his garage for a couple weeks.
Last 30 years.
Yeah. No, but it's and it's hard to even formulate a point out of this, because I think it speaks to just the utter uncertainty of games. Like, what is a game? Can you build some super simplistic thing and have it be compelling? Yeah, you can. There's literally been weekend projects. Yeah, Flappy Bird. You could build that in like a half hour if you know what you're doing, and you could make millions. But then at the same time, there's these games that literally cost millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, and they make whatever, 100 million. I actually don't know the economics of games these days, but it just speaks to the incredible range of games. And, you can think of creative works as being similar. Like, I'm sure there's a lot of films that have been produced fairly cheaply that did really well, like Blair Witch Project or something like that. But I feel like even in those cases, like the cheapest movie is, in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, I think their budget was something like $50,000 for that movie, which it's all at once like sounds like a lot, and also it's unbelievable that they made it for that cheaply.
Yeah, well, and also that's such a rare occurrence. I mean, I'm trying to think of other films that had that like small of a budget and were able to achieve that level of success.
Okay, I totally lied. $200,000 to $500,000. Okay, so I can.
Well, and I'm sure like more than half of that was marketing, because I remember they were one of the first people to have that crazy viral marketing campaign, which was so effective. But yeah, I don't know what point I was trying to make, but I think the video game industry is just crazy. It doesn't adhere to any like set of laws of physics or anything. It's just crazy.
Well, one takeaway from what you had said, which I think is actually a really good point, is you said there's such a range, right? And I think that's true. And in the indie space, you have a bunch of this shovelware. You have a bunch of these terrible games that no one ever talks about because they're terrible. And it's like, of course, it's easy to like cherry pick the 3 people who have been able to make games by themselves and make really compelling visions. But then you have all of these other people who are spending a tremendous amount of time and they're not making any money.
Right.
So it's kind of like, it's probably not a really fair comparison because in a way, I think if you're working in a big game studio, there's kind of this diffusion of risk. It's like, yeah, this game studio is going to make a couple of really popular games, but they're also going to make a bunch of duds that they spend a ton of money on, but never make as much money as they spent to develop it. So you're insulated from that risk as a game developer. Like maybe you make more money, maybe you get a bonus or something if the game you work on really succeeds. But it's like, if the game that you built flops, like you didn't take on that risk. And maybe that's a little bit of where, the rewards are just like a little bit more lopsided in indie.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is why I think it can be good to like do a little bit of time in the industry, join
do some time.
Yeah. Do some
behind
time
bars at Ubisoft.
Well, because I've heard this story at least a few times. I think World of Goo was a famous example where developers go to a big company and, it's not a super great experience, but, you learn the craft, you learn the trade. And then you build your own thing when you actually know what you're doing. And just circling back to the book, I think the framework in the book, the way of thinking about the problem of design, that's something that takes years to learn. I think some people naturally have it maybe, but I think usually it takes years to like really learn all these things and internalize them. I'm 38 years old and I'm still learning this stuff. So, maybe that's an argument for spending some time as a quote unquote professional and kind of honing this craft a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And one thing I will say is this book, it's interesting because this chapter feels a little out of place in this book because it is so like business heavy in a book that has otherwise been completely devoid of any sort of business information. But it's like, this is boring, but it's also the stuff you'll need to learn like regardless if you ever want to start a business doing anything that's even if it's not game design. And it's like, it talks about lifetime value, it talks about having to pay for marketing and it's all super valuable stuff. So in a way I was almost more interested in it from the roles as a business owner as opposed to like as a game developer. But
no, the chapter definitely had a lot of useful information. But why don't we bring it home with these 3 questions that we were discussing?
So, just to wrap the whole thing in a bow, just our high level sense for the art of game design.
And I think now, were you saying these 3 questions will apply to all the books we read?
I think that's the plan. Let's this will be the new thing. And these feel generic. These could apply to any book in my opinion.
Yeah. Love it.
The first one was who would get the most value out of this book? Is that I think this was your framing. Is that how we were framing it?
Yeah, I like that. Who would get the most value? And I thought about this a little bit. I'll just throw out my quick take on this. I think the book was providing a framework for thinking about the problem of design. If you're trying to build something, design is a problem that needs to be solved. You need to understand like how to take a list of requirements and actually turn it into a concrete application or video game or whatever, could be anything. And I think this book did a really good job of laying out the framework for thinking about that problem, which it's hard to even say this because it's very meta. The book provided a lot of tools, a lot of very surgical tools for dealing with little aspects of the problem of design. Mm-hmm. But it also provided this framework for thinking about the problem of design that I think is really valuable if you are, early in your career, maybe you're in college or you're an aspiring designer or something. This framework for thinking about design is incredibly valuable. So I think the group who would get the most value out of this book are, a little bit younger, maybe a little bit new to the industry, people who want to be designers. And that's not to say that the book didn't have a ton of value for other people. I'm old. I've been a software engineer for decades, and I thought this book was amazing. But I think that those are the people who'd get the most value out of this.
Okay. Yeah, I think I would mostly agree with what you're saying, with the one caveat of I think this book is useful for anyone who's starting to make the move from being an IC into a role where they're coordinating the efforts of multiple people.
Yes.
So there's so much about humanity and human psychology and stuff that you basically never see in coding books. And so I would say if you're kind of in a technical role as an individual contributor, and now you're starting to need to take on these larger problems, and that can take any form. You could be starting to manage a small team within a company, starting your own company, starting a game company, I think all of these things you can benefit a lot from the stories that Jesse Schell has, where you're trying to, understand what people want.
Yes.
That's something we didn't really talk about, but he goes into this, the 3 layers of desire, which which I thought was really impactful. And that'll come in, just as you're starting to peek your head up from trying to do your starter project at a company, all of those things will start to become super valuable. So,
yes, no, I agree. I found myself wishing I had read this book a long time ago, because there's so many things in this book where he describes things that you will learn in your career, but you'll learn through, accidents or through, just muddling through it for the first time. He actually describes these things. So if I were to have read this book, 15 years ago or something, it would have helped a great deal with just having some awareness of these, these problems that I'm going to run into later in my career.
Okay, so then maybe that segues. So second question, how much impact did this book have on you and you think the rest of your life?
Yeah. Well, do you want to throw an answer out?
Sure. Yeah. I think a lot of what you said is good, where it's this is an affirmation of lessons that I have learned along the way in my career as I've taken on more leadership-y roles and started to try to understand solving these sorts of problems. I mean, there's a lot of game mechanic specific stuff that I never really learned, but I don't know that that's actually, if I'm thinking about broad value, I think the more generic lessons are actually more generally useful. So it's funny because I think maybe the biggest impact might be if we ever continue on with Godland, if we turn that into a thing, that might be the biggest thing, where it'll turn out to be a project that we try to 3D print and design this game, and it'll be so that's what I would say as the most material impact that this book is going to have. No,
I really like that. One thing I would add is, and I think I may have kind of already said this, but I'll just say it again, I guess, is this book did so many, like, there's so many little tiny things that you go through or you learn, but you just don't really put it into words, or you don't think about it concretely. You're just sort of working through it. And I think what this book did that I found very interesting was it discussed all of those things.
Yes.
And I guess I'm trying to think of an example, like, maybe like prototyping. I feel like this is a bad example. I wish I could think of a better one, but like, prototyping is something that you naturally do. And, when you're prototyping, you naturally think of like the trade-offs of, is this going to be a throwaway prototype versus, are there aspects of this I can use versus like, how long should I spend on this in order to make it compelling so that it actually like proves the value of the idea. And these are all things that you practically go through in your experience, but it helps so much to have it, read about it and read, concretely, like all of the various things you should think about while prototyping. Because I just think there's a difference between, doing it a bunch of times and sort of like learning things by experience versus, seeing it written down and seeing it described, concisely. And I thought that was helpful. It sort of buttressed a lot of opinions and skills that I've developed over time. It sort of buttressed them with like the textbook description of them.
Yes.
If that makes sense. Which I thought that helped me a lot. It confirmed some of my ideas. It made me feel a little bit better about, some things that I've done in the past or, problems I've run into. And so that was huge.
I think that's a really good point. And I wonder, do you think this is the kind of thing that you might do for yourself in your own life? Like, try to do that naming or create a handle or distill some of your own personal experiences.
Maybe. I mean, I do think that like a lot of I actually wrote down in my notes, like, what is Godland's handle? Because I just thought it was a really interesting exercise to go through. And by the way, my handle was be a god, smite puny humans. That was my handle.
Oh, that's amazing.
I thought that sounded appealing. But anyway, yeah, I do think this book has a ton of useful exercises that you can apply to. I could literally apply this to my career. Like I have a lot of designs, which I actually think a handle or some sort of zinger, or tagline or whatever would help them a lot. And maybe I'll actually go do that because I just think that's a valuable exercise.
To go back to refactoring.
Yeah.
There's a smell in there that's called refused bequest. And I think I remember it because it was a hilarious name.
Yeah.
But there have just been times where I'm like, oh, this is like refused bequest right now. Like,
yes.
And you can just tell, like, it just makes it more clear like what is going on and why it's unsettling to you. And so like, I think, to be more general about it, like you're just going to get into scenarios where you're like, oh, wait a minute. Like this is like what Jesse Schell was talking about. Yes. I think if anything, the 3 layers of desire might be another thing that I take away from this book. I think this is another one of the like gems in this book is like, okay, what does this person really want? So
yes. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. So the last question was, do you think Jesse Schell accomplished his goal in writing this book?
Do you want to kick us off?
So the short answer is yes. I think it's a great book. I think Jesse Schell, if I were to put myself in Jesse Schell's head when he was starting to write this book, I think his goal was to provide a very useful artifact for designers that summarized lessons that he's picked up in a successful career. I don't think he was trying to do some sort of like canonical reference. I mean, maybe that was partially his goal, but I don't think that he set out to do that. I think he wanted to be a little bit more, talking through the lens of his own experience and sort of listing the important lessons he's learned. And I think he really did that. I think he did a really good job of it. So, yeah, I guess I would flip it back to you. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, he has this kind of guru, and like I think guru has a negative connotation as someone who's like a charlatan who doesn't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
But I almost like a Mr. Miyagi vibe where he's like I've lived a life full of these like experiences,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna like write all these down, and I think I think he has accomplished that
Yes.
really well. In a way, I almost like, and I'm not sure how you would get around this, but it's almost like, I wonder if it's like mistitled. As we've talked, like it's so useful in a bunch of these different ways. Where it's like, yeah, like these are important skills if you're designing a game, but it's also important for like a trillion other things.
What was
I'm
this
not sure
book called again?
The Art of Game Design.
Ah, okay.
But it's
yeah.
almost like the art of creating a technical business, or like,
Yeah.
I know that's like a terrible title, but I think that it's almost more appropriate. Like, yeah, there are game specific stuff, but like there's so much about like translating, what people are talking about, working together, creating design doc. It's like all stuff that is super useful to understand.
I do feel like it was much broader. The material he covered was much broader than that title. Another thing that I wanted to go back to, which you mentioned, is like the level of abstraction at which this book is written. Because I think if you're writing a book like this, that's such an important decision to make very early on, which is like, okay, hey, if I'm introducing, like let's say we're writing a book about software. If we're introducing like software design, for instance, are we going to like list out every pattern we're aware of and like really describe each pattern, sort of like the Gang of Four book? You could, that would be more like a textbook or like a reference manual or something. But I think that Jesse Schell made the decision to go a few levels of abstraction higher. Mm-hmm. He discusses things very conceptually. He does often give concrete examples, which I really like, but most of the book, I would argue, I guess, sort of stays at this higher level of abstraction. Yeah. Which I think still makes it very, very valuable, but it also, it's not a reference manual. It's very much like it almost read like a biography of his career or something in a way. Like, I know he didn't talk, it's not like he was constantly talking about his own career. He had a bunch of examples and stuff, but yeah, it was almost like a what I've learned type of book. Which, I found very valuable. I thought it was super interesting.
Did you read the last chapter or at all, even just like the intro?
Probably not if it wasn't on our list.
It was not. It was called Goodbye. The first chapter was called Hello, and the last chapter was called Goodbye.
Okay, I should read it.
It's funny that you say that because the last chapter is essentially a nod to that fact, because he wraps it up as though he was just some old man like rambling for the last several hours. He's like, well, look at the time. This could be the text of a book or something to that effect. So in a way, like I think he acknowledges that dynamic. That's kind of how it's coming off.
It plays into something that I've thought about a lot, which is like, if there are people who are they've been in the career for a long, long time, they will just inadvertently be producing value. Yeah. Like, and I don't want to like, I'm an old man, so I think I have a tendency to like really value older people. But I've noticed, I have actually experienced this many times in my career. And I'm also like thinking back to when I was super young, and like I would sort of ignore old people, but thinking back to what they were often concerned about or talking about, like they were actually the right, they knew what they were talking about. So I sort of see that I missed that in my earlier career. But yeah, the whole point I'm driving at is like, I really enjoy just hearing someone who's been around the block just talk about their experience. And I think that was part of what was really appealing about this book, is because on a certain level, it was just Jesse Shull. You know, he's done a bunch of different things and a bunch of different, you know, like he did those weird VR AR-esque experiences for Disney or whatever.
Yeah.
And it was just an opportunity for him to kind of talk about his various experiences and sort of dole out these little nuggets of wisdom in the process. And I kind of wish, I want to read more books like this. Like I want to read more books by like software engineers and, you know, just people in various industries who wrote stuff like this. Cause I found it was really interesting. It was a cool way to go about discussing the material.
It's interesting because I feel like that decision means that it's going to stay relevant for longer. You know, the fact that he wrote it at a higher level.
Yeah.
He wasn't like,
agreed.
Here's what 3D mesh format you should be exporting your characters in. Yeah. You know, he talks about technology in the abstract.
Right.
And it's like he was able to draw on the first Mickey Mouse video about like how, you know, what technologies made that possible. And I think it was a valuable decision. And I think to your point, or you didn't say this explicitly, it's like, yeah, this isn't a reference text for when you're trying to solve like some compiler bug in whatever, like your code isn't compiling. But, you know, it's going to teach you about how to like approach these problems in the bigger picture.
Agree. Yeah.
I did want to say one last comment, because I feel like if we didn't evaluate these two aspects, it would be kind of like not the whole picture. I think the lenses was a really interesting concept, and I think it added interest to the process of reading through the book.
Yes. Yeah. No, I really like that, because this is something that's really important in our industry, actually, is you often have a problem, and it's a very valuable exercise to be able to look at that problem through different lenses. Like we just talked about being able to see user experience feedback from the standpoint of like a product manager who needs to convert it into like a real thing to build, or from the standpoint of an engineer who like sees an incredibly complicated solution versus like a simple solution. And I think that mental framework, like forcing yourself to look through several lenses when analyzing a problem, is a very valuable mental framework to have. So I thought it was cool that, you know, he approached the material in that way.
Yeah, I think the question is going to be like, have I indexed these in a way that I would know when to apply a particular lens, you know?
Yeah, which I don't think I did a good job of, but I still really appreciate just this way of thinking about things. You know, like really forcing yourself to take a step back from a problem and think of it through multiple lenses. I just think that's, I mean, this is totally unrelated to design or anything. That's just a very valuable way to like use your brain.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was cool that he incorporated that so fundamentally into the material.
And then the very last thing that I did want to say, we haven't alluded to this, but in the book, he had this map that he was building up like chapter by chapter.
Yeah.
And I just have to say, like, that was actually a complete failure of functionality. Like, it was pretty ugly.
Yes.
I actually am not sure what his goal was with the map. Basically, in complete contrast to the lenses, which I think are going to wind up being useful in the future and, like, made the book more enjoyable to read through. If I had one recommendation about something to change, it would be just cut the map out altogether. It is completely valueless in this book.
It's hilarious you mentioned this, because I thought on several occasions that he was going to like, that the map was going to culminate into like a joke, that there is no map. Like I legit thought this in my head while I was reading the book. Like, oh, remember that map that we've been drawing? That was just like my drunk scribblings on like Thursday at the bar. There is no actual map. Like, I thought he was going to make this joke. So, yeah, I agree.
Maybe he does in Goodbye. And he's like, as you can see, the map is just this tangled mess. And, like, there's not one route through it. He probably does say that. But along the way, you're like, he's at least as far as I can tell, like he's not making references to the map in the text itself. It's just this like weird appendix in like the, it's just this thing like dangling off of the beginning of every chapter.
Yeah. Very weird.
And so that was the one thing. But like, hopefully by contrast, that demonstrates like, I did think the rest of this book was like very valuable. That's kind of the only thing that I thought did not land for me.
Yeah, no, I agree. But no, this was a great book. I really had fun reading it, and I had a huge amount of fun just chatting about it with you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so that's The Art of Game Design. Wrap it up, ship it out. We're gonna
done.
Call it a book.
Hell yeah! All right, Matt. All right. I will see you next time.
See you next time.